get started. It's hard to compete with the podcast and Bishop Curry, and I'm sure it's fantastic. So I'm glad they're having some extra time to finish up. But I want to be respectful of our time together, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we have about an hour together to talk about putting together a racial reconciliation pilgrimage. This is a combination of kind of nuts and bolts, the how to put together from the planning and how do you pick sites and all that kind of thing, to also the more spiritual component as well. So how do you, what's different from a mission trip to a pilgrimage, and what's different specifically for a racial reconciliation pilgrimage. But before I get started, I'm Kate Kearney-Houston. I am from the Diocese of Oklahoma. I'm the Director of Youth and Young Adults there, and I'm also the Program Director for our Ione School of Formation. It's a big mouthful. And in that role, we are expanding our Iona program, which has historically been for ordination. We're now expanding it to lay people as well, and then also continuing ed for our clergy. And so I've been brought on board to do that. And one of the things I'm hopeful to be able to offer through our Iona School is some of our pilgrimage materials for our adults in our diocese. So just a little bit of background and differences. I started at the diocese in January of 2019, January 1st. So I've not been there a long time, but I was just a block down the street at the cathedral for about 10 years doing parish ministry. And we did a number of large mission trips that took a lot of our smaller congregations in the diocese joined us in those mission trips. We had the resources and ability to do that, and the coordination, especially as a full-time person in a congregation. And so some of our other congregations would join with us. And so we'd been going on mission trips for a number of years. And one of the rectors who typically went with us and I have been talking about kind of flipping the narrative a little bit. We wanted to do something a little bit different. We didn't really want to do a mission trip. We wanted to do something that dug a little deeper and also kind of took us more on a spiritual journey rather than more service. We wanted to combine those things a little bit more. At that same time, the director of children and adult formation at the diocese, Sabrina Evans, approached Emily and I about putting together a pilgrimage for racial reconciliation. And so it was a perfect timing because we'd been looking at doing the same thing. And then being able to offer it at the diocesan level, and then I literally came onto the diocesan staff just a couple months later. So it was all kind of very fruitful. But in that experience, one of the things we really wanted to do, we struggled with this idea about whether or not we called it a pilgrimage. Like, would people go if you see the word pilgrimage, especially young people? They know what a pilgrimage is. And we thought, we're going to keep that word. And one of the reasons we wanted to keep that word was because the word pilgrimage is so historical to our church and to who we are as a people going back hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so when you look at the idea of pilgrimage, the idea of a journey, we really wanted to maintain that. And so we started to dig in on that word rather than go with trip or journey or mission trip, something like that. And we also really wanted to draw the line about what we were actually doing. And so we sought to intentionally look at how we were going to put together a program that would attract young people to come, that they would give up 10 days. It wasn't quite 10 days, so don't freak out. But how they would give up time in their summer to come journey with us to Alabama and Louisiana and Tennessee and Arkansas. Now, we're from Oklahoma, so you'd think that we're kind of adjusted to the heat, but it's a different world when you get down into Louisiana in July. And so I would tell people, well, we're going to go to New Orleans in July or June, and they just would look at me like I was crazy. So how do we kind of get that message out? We started with a process of kind of putting together just kind of the stages, like what we were going to do, putting together the program. And so the first part, I really spent a lot of time in kind of research and education for myself. And so I'll talk about that process a little bit. Then we spent some time doing program development, communication and advertising, the registration process I'm going to talk about a little bit. I know we talked a little earlier about cost and how you can kind of deal with that. The pre-pilgrimage retreat and day that we took, I'm going to talk about those specifically, and then the pilgrimage itself, and then our post-pilgrimage. And then I'll have questions at the end. So this, in terms of research and education, I thought it was really important that I personally spent some time getting myself ready for this process. So I'm a huge reader. So I bought a lot of books and was very ambitious, and then didn't get through quite as much as I wanted to, like we all do. But I really intentionally kind of set out a reading plan for myself about what I wanted to read, what I wanted to steep myself in. I'm also a big podcaster, so I listened to some variety of podcasts. The 1619 stuff had just come out from the New York Times, and it's good. There's also some problematic elements of it as well, but they had a podcast element of that, so we used that. And so I really kind of tried to steep myself personally in history and narrative and stories. And probably one of my favorite podcasts that I found was something called All My Relations. And it's two Indigenous women who talk about genealogy and family stories. And while it wasn't specific to our racial reconciliation journey this time, it has been fantastic in setting up what we're going to do next summer, which is a Trail of Tears racial reconciliation, which those of us in Oklahoma really need to have hard conversations about. And so that has been very helpful in kind of getting my mind wrapped around that as well. I also did some training. So I don't know how many of you have ever done the youth curriculum training from the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Justice and the Diocese of Atlanta. They have a great youth curriculum. It's actually being published now. And I did that training last year at the Forma conference in Indianapolis. I also did racial diversity training, and I also did some facilitator training as well, specific to facilitating when you talk about tough topics, which I think is really important, specifically because we need to be able to facilitate conversations that can be difficult. And so that was one of the things that I really wanted to do for myself in my own training. And then I also really did deep dives on orientation to space. So what I mean by that is I spent a lot of time with Google. And Google and I did a lot of Google search, did a lot of Google image search, and I really wanted to spend time getting to know the physical places, the history of those places, looking at Google Maps, seeing what the layout around a particular place was, because what we wanted when we started to put this pilgrimage together was to really tell a story, that each place we went was telling a particular story. And so to do that, I really felt like I didn't need to just look at X museum. I needed to look at what was the history. How did that museum get there? Why did that specific place, why was it selected? What's around that museum? And so that was really helpful in kind of putting together the narrative and the stories, and also just for my own organization in my head about how we were going to do this. Really spending that time doing that deep research for myself. A lot of that never saw the light of day necessarily in the sense of translating that into the pilgrimage itself, but we were able to add elements of it in where we felt like it was necessary into the story, and so that was really helpful. So just in terms of program development, this is one of those more nuts and bolts piece. So you want to, of course, build your team. I built my chaplaincy team really early on in the process, and then my volunteers later. And Oklahoma, while we're very racially diverse, I didn't have the ability, unfortunately, to take people we have a limited number of racially diverse clergy, and they're really busy, and they just couldn't come. And I asked, and I asked, and I asked, and it wasn't going to happen. And so I lucked out, however, that I picked 2 clergy that work in racially diverse communities. Emily Schnabel, who's on the bottom picture, works in a congregation in Midwest City, which is a suburb of Oklahoma City, which is our predominantly African-American suburb, and has a very diverse parish. Spencer Brown also works in a diverse parish in Tulsa. And so that was something that I really wanted, were people that worked in diverse communities and understood diverse communities. And so I was specific about that. And Spencer's actually here at the conference. Volunteers, as many of you know, who work on trips with young people, sometimes you just have to kind of get what you want. I mean, you say, can you come? And people say yes, and people say no. I had a great group of volunteers. It was not particularly diverse. I wish it had been. I wish I knew a way to make it more diverse, and I think that's a conversation that we can engage in, certainly in the question and answer session at the end. But that was something that I really wanted to do that I was not able to do. It was a value, but it wasn't. So balance was really important. So the balancing of, who you pick to come, who is able to come. And I will tell you, from a practicality perspective, having people who can drive vehicles is really important. So there's the practical parts of it. There's also the spiritual parts of it. What gifts and skills do people bring? Having somebody who is medical staff was really important, just so if we had any questions, et cetera. So having that diversity and balance was really important in both our chaplaincy team and in our volunteers. So content, the biggest piece of content was that we really wanted to think thematically. And what we meant by that is that every day had a theme. Every day, what we did fed into a larger narrative and kind of flowed from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And so when we started to lay out the program of what we wanted to do, I didn't go to the nuts and bolts first. And I am a spreadsheet person. Like, I want to color code everything and spreadsheet everything and budget everything. And I didn't. I actually held myself back from that and instead really looked at the arc. What is the story I want to tell today? What is the story that we want our youth to walk away with from today? And how do we want that to kind of hit through the week? And so we intentionally started with talking about slavery and enslaved persons. And from Oklahoma, we decided to go to New Orleans. And the history of New Orleans is somewhat unique, but we really wanted to talk about the experience of enslaved people. And we wanted to go, New Orleans has some plantations that are preserved that specifically tell the story from an enslaved person's perspective. We wanted to walk in the parts of Old Town New Orleans, to walk where the slave ships would come in, where people were unloaded, where they were sold, which they were sold in a house that is now a restaurant that has the exact same name, and you would never know it. And so we wanted to tell those stories. And I'll come back to New Orleans in a little bit. So that was where we wanted to start. Then we wanted to move in kind of a timeline fashion. So how do we get from there through the Civil War, through the experience of Jim Crow, and into the Civil Rights Movement? And so we kind of wanted to move on a timeline arc. And so by the time we get to Montgomery and Birmingham, and then on our way back, Memphis into Little Rock, where we're really talking about civil rights. And so we kind of wanted to start at a place, and we thought it was really important to start there. That if we started with civil rights, we weren't going to be able to really get our young people to understand. It was almost like going back. And so we really wanted to start with this conversation about enslaved persons, and then move into this conversation about civil rights. We talked a lot, Spencer, Emily, and I talked a lot about the spiritual development. And so part of the process for our training, which I'll talk about here in a second, dealt with this question of putting together a covenant. So if you've looked at the youth curriculum from the Absalom Jones Center in the Diocese of Atlanta, they have the young people put together a covenant agreement. And so we did that. We kind of had them at their pre-pilgrimage retreat put together a covenant, and then we used that as our part of our spiritual practice during the pilgrimage. And so it was less covenant, more theological statement language. So we adjusted that a little bit. And so Emily and Spencer took the conversations that we had at our pre-pilgrimage retreat and drafted them into a theological statement that was effectively written by our young people. And I'm really proud of it. We actually changed just a little bit more of the language, and it's now our theological statement for our youth program in the diocese. And so they did a fantastic job. So we really started with that. We wanted them to kind of craft a theological idea and theological statement about how we treat one another, and rooted in our baptismal covenant. And then from there, we went to talking about how we wanted to envelop worship and liturgy and spiritual experience into our pilgrimage. And so we did debriefing sessions every day, but they weren't your traditional debriefing sessions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. We worshiped every day. Compline, morning prayer. We worshiped before we got into the vans. We worshiped at specific sites. Probably the most spiritual piece and really kind of the crux day where you really felt the shift was the day that we did a silent pilgrimage walk with intermittent prayer at the Jonathan Daniels locations in Haynesville. And so that was really, we kind of just wanted to make sure that each and every one of our places there was something spiritual that we were going to be able to kind of take away. To mark that, we were very specific about giving people from each place that we went a bead. And so each place that we went, they started with a plain leather kind of piece around their wrist, and we talked about what that symbolized. And then each bead, as we went, we gave. And at the beginning, they were kind of like, I have this one bead on this string. I don't really get it. What do you mean? And you told me what it's about, but... And then the next bead we'd add, and the next bead we'd add, and the next bead we'd add. And through each day, the youth really got this construction of a narrative. And so the first day, we repeated what we had talked about with each bead, and then the next day, we repeated it again. And some days had multiple beads, and they could talk about how we went from this rough kind of experience into a different kind of bead every single day. And at the end, they could tell the narrative of their trip by using their bracelet. They could literally go home and tell their parents or their friends that what they did each day by telling the narrative of what they were wearing on their wrists. And so that was an important piece, and then we lost them at the end. I think important for content development is the idea to stay big, to look at the big picture, not get too much into the minutia early on in the process, but to really, again, to stay big picture. In that stays, you do have to do the practical things. You do have to dig into what are the practical pieces. So you have to figure out where you're staying. You have to figure out what you need reservations for, whether it's museums or restaurants, especially if you're hauling around a big group of people. In total, we were about 36 people. How are you going to get from place to place? And then, of course, what the cost is. When I came in, the cost had already been set. And so they had already set the cost at $300 to do this. And so I already knew what the budget was, and it was a little nervous. It's a big trip to take on $300 per person. And so we did run a deficit at the end, a couple of $1,000s, but we were also happy with the program that it was really worth it, and it was the first year for it. And then this year so far, we're doing a pilgrimage program this summer to Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Washington D.C. going into EYE, and we're running right on track for budget. So, but we had to increase it to $600. So I know we talked earlier about cost and what's an appropriate level of cost, and that's where the budgeting comes in. So I'll talk about that in a second. The staying part, where you're going to stay, when you're traveling with young people, you can stay on church floors. For me, the biggest thing is showers. I like to shower. I like to be clean. I like for the people I'm traveling in very close quarters with to be clean. And so it can be daunting to kind of figure out where. We had great experiences with all the places we stayed. We had a few issues that we ran into along the way, which had nothing to do with the congregations, but more to do with weather and some other things. But doing a lot of research on where you're going, what are the communities there? Are there places you can stay for free if that's in your budget? Are there places you can stay and that you have to charge? What are their facilities like? So calling and asking those questions. I recommend doing that as early as you can in your process of planning. I did that about 6 months out. This year I already have everything booked. And I did that about 2 months ago. So I did it more like 8 months out. And that just made a big difference for us. Just those 2 months, getting on people's calendars, getting deposits in, those kinds of things. What do you need a reservation for? So looking at the big things that you want to do, where do you think you need reservations, calling ahead, getting those reservations, paying if you need to pay, those kinds of things. Is really important, especially if you're traveling with a larger group of people and you're going into museums or you're going to memorial sites. If you want someone to come and talk to your group, we had a fantastic National Park Ranger in Little Rock who talked with us. He was scheduled to talk to us for 15 minutes. He talked with us for 45 minutes. And I had called and we couldn't get into Little Rock High School because they do an education piece every year where they bring teachers in from across the country and teach them civil rights history at the high school, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, it was the same time we were going to be there, so we couldn't get in. But we had this ranger who came and spoke with us, and it was probably one of the best talks we had the entire trip. He just did such a good job. But I had to call and get it on the books. And they only gave us 15 minutes, and then he spent 45 with us. So, but just even having those times and having those conversations, you can't really drop in with almost 40 people. Same thing with if you're going to go to a restaurant. Make sure you have all those reservations in place. How are you moving around? A lot of people asked if we were taking a charter bus. At $300 a person, we were not taking a charter bus. So I had to have enough drivers to be able to drive vehicles. Vans, and we had on our mission trips we mostly took Suburbans. We took moving vans. We took 3 large vans and the storage van. On this trip this summer we're taking SUVs. I have more adults who are coming, so it just kind of depends, but you kind of have to look at what your needs are, what your storage needs are. Are you taking big coolers? Are you taking, and then looking at that as well as the cost. In terms of cost, my biggest recommendation on cost is to budget it out, is to really spend some time looking at what you want to do, how much it costs. Our trip this summer, for example, Williamsburg and Jamestown are relatively expensive. Once you get to DC, the only thing that's really expensive is food, because most of what the things that you do in DC are free. And you just have to make reservations to bring a large group in, but they're still free. And so you can kind of, look at what those costs are and then plan from there. So our one this summer is $600. Next year we'll probably back it back down a little bit because we'll be back on the road more day to day. We won't be staying in one place and needing to pay for that. So it's a movable target. How do you get people to pay for it? I think a lot of that is in this next piece, which is communication and advertising. People have to know that what they're getting is worth something, and they have to be willing to pay. A lot of our churches don't have the capacity to pay for all of their kids to come. A few of them do. Our cathedral, a couple of our other large churches have that capacity, but unfortunately a lot of our others don't. So we help them and assist them with fundraising. We do have a scholarship program, but the diocese already actually underwrites the cost of the pilgrimage by 50%. And so we really put, to some extent, the opportunity for our churches and our youth that want to come. We try to make sure that we resource them and help them. So I help them with a fundraiser. We do essentially a shareholder buying program where people buy shares in the young person, so to go on this trip. And so they're buying shares, and then the young person, when they come back, has a responsibility to their shareholders to present them with what they learned from the trip. And so you can either do that as a youth group opportunity or as an individual. You can sell them to people in your church, you can sell them to your family, you can sell them to a variety of people, and you set the own price of what you want your share to be. $10, $5, $20, whatever works for you and your community. And we help them with all the resources for that. And it's actually been really successful. We had a moderate-sized parish raise over $5,500 in 2 Sundays by selling shares. And they're able to send almost 7 kids and 2 adults on the trip. So in terms of how you communicate, making sure that communication is clear and timely. I think you have to start way in advance. Summer schedules fill up, you have camps, you have other opportunities. If you're talking teenagers, you have work. And so making sure that you're doing it enough in advance is really important. And the more communication that you have is better. So we did flyers, emails, Facebook, email to our group, our youth group, our weekly newsletter. We kind of peppered it everywhere. And then we set a really clear registration deadline and didn't have a problem getting registrations in. We had more problems with people wanting to get in after when we had filled. And so I think one of the biggest things is to say to people, you have to sign up by this date. And I know that scares people because they're like, well, if I don't make by this date. But I have found that if you're really clear about the date that people have to register by and it's early enough, you can kind of fudge on the back end a little bit with letting people in, but you have to make sure that you have that group. Because if you keep kind of extending the deadline out and extending the deadline out and extending the deadline out, then what happens is then you're too late to cancel things. This year we're flying. I have to book plane tickets. I don't have the ability to kind of allow a lot of late registrants unless they're willing to book their own plane tickets. When we look at the type of communication, I have found that pictures over words make a difference. So people being able to see the places they're going to go, being able to see the museum, being able to see the location, be able to see the street. And so I really do more pictures than words, or I'll do titles of names. One of the things we did this summer was kind of a map. So we did a map that was part of our registration that showed what the journey would look like, and then kind of dotted it along like what you're going to see with pictures along the way. And then showing pictures of people and places. What I mean by people is not necessarily people who've gone on a pilgrimage before, but the types of diversity that they're going to see, the places they're going to see, the people they're going to see, and to give them kind of a bit of an experience when they look at the materials for the pilgrimage. to kind of entice people to say, oh, this is going to be different and interesting, and I really want to go on it. And that's been our experience. And I'm willing to share any of our advertising materials and our communication materials. Our director of technology is here as well, and she helps me with these things. She's fantastic. Her name's Sarah Smith. And she and I would both be willing to share whatever we have with you. In terms of registration, forms matter. You've got to have good forms. And so making sure that you have all of the pieces, a health form, a theological statement, a community covenant, all of those things when you take young people. We made a change this year in our youth programming on registration forms. Historically, 18-year-olds have signed their own forms. I changed that. Now, if you are participating in a trip, whether you're 18 or not, your parents still sign the form, or your guardians, whoever is financially responsible for you. If we had somebody who was emancipated, we would certainly have them sign their own forms. But we wanted to have a little bit more buy-in from the people who were supporting the young person on the pilgrimage. And we wanted them to know what they were doing. And so our form isn't so much, there's a health form, there's an image release, all the things that you would normally contain, but there's also a section for parents or guardians that is specific to what is it that my child is doing and understanding what my child is going to learn. And so that's actually how we communicated. We had a parent meeting as well before we went, but we also wanted to communicate in the written document an understanding of what the young people were going to gain from that experience. And so we put that into the document and had parents or guardians initial that document as they went through. How to handle money. This is, I think, the bane of my existence. I hate trying to figure out how to handle money, whether it's for summer camp or any of our programs. How do you get money in? Do you invoice? Do you set it up? We use a system called Blackbaud, which is a system that they can register and then pay online. This year we're doing it a little bit differently. Last year we had them pay a registration fee and then pay the balance by a specific date. This year we have that. We have pay a basic deposit and then pay by this specific date. But we also have, because it's more money, it's $600, we have a payment plan option for our families. And so it's a 6-month payment plan beginning in February and ending in July. And so our families are able to sign up for that if they want to do that option. It's always a hard conversation to talk about money with people, but it's one of those things that unfortunately we have to do. And so I am pretty firm about deadlines. I try to be really generous. So we dropped the level of the deposit, but because we increased the price. So we wanted to make sure that it was still accessible to people. We also make sure that we have many different ways that we can accept funds from people as well. And our churches have been exceptionally generous in this as well. We have a church that does not have really any youth to go on the pilgrimage program, but they sent a scholarship. So some of our churches that even aren't sending youth are participating, which is fantastic. So our pre-pilgrimage and retreat. So we spent a weekend in March, last March, Friday night to Sunday afternoon. We had all of our kids and some of our adults, most of them. We had a couple that couldn't come. And we did the youth curriculum from the Absalom Jones Center in the Diocese of Atlanta. That curriculum, if you look at it and you read it, there are two options. So you can kind of do it as like an every week thing you might do at a youth group, or you can do it set up as a weekend retreat. The weekend retreat is intense. It is a long weekend retreat, and it is intense. And I could even tell by Sunday that we were like, oh my gosh. but we tried to make sure that we had enough opportunity. But what I really thought was most important about that retreat was we had young people who got together and got to know one another. And if you're going on a pilgrimage, you're going on a trip together, I think it's incredibly important for people to know one another, to feel comfortable with one another. And because we were digging into tough topics, it was incredibly important that people feel like they could talk to one another. And so we did the curriculum as it's written for the most part, and we had people really dig in to some of those tough topics that are in the curriculum. And I felt like it was successful. I know one of our adults this year who's coming again. She went last year as a volunteer. She's coming again this year as a volunteer. And she said, we're doing a pre-pilgrimage retreat again, but it's not a whole weekend. It's just a day. And she said, I'm going to come, but do I have to face somebody and sit with my knees touching somebody else's knees? She was like, I don't think I can do that again. And I said, I promise you I won't do that this year, but I won't promise you in the future that won't happen. So the structure is contextual. So if you do a retreat versus a weekly, it's up to you. It depends. As a diocese, we can't do an every week thing. It wasn't possible. We had to do a retreat. If you're taking a group from a church, one specific church or two specific churches, you can probably do a longer time training. That's completely contextual for what you want to do. And then we did a day in June. So we did the retreat in March, and then we did a day in June in Tulsa at the Greenwood Cultural Center and the Greenwood Tulsa Memorial. So Greenwood was the traditionally African-American part of town in Tulsa. It was traditionally, historically known as Black Wall Street. And it was razed to the ground in a riot. To this day, we're about to commemorate the 100th anniversary this year. So 2020 and 2021 will be the 100th year commemorating the massacre in Tulsa. And they still cannot tell you how many people were killed. And so there's this big debate going on in Tulsa about mass graves. How much research should we do into identifying the number of bodies in mass graves, identifying who they are, if we can, with dental records. And it's a tough topic for Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma. I did not hear about the Greenwood Massacre until I was in my early 30s. I had heard there was a black riot. That is not what it was. I grew up in Oklahoma. I did not hear about the Osage Native American murders until the book came out. In Oklahoma, we're not good about talking about our racial history. And so one of the things that I felt was incredibly important was for our young people to go to Tulsa and spend a day before we went and looked at other places, which for some of you are not other places, but for us they are. Before we go look at other places, Montgomery and Birmingham, that we understand that it's not other places. It's everywhere. It's where we are. It's in our homes. It's in our churches. It's in our own history, our own families. And so we spent the day there, and then we watched the documentary Traces of the Trade, which some of you may be familiar with as well, and then had dinner and had a conversation. And we invited our parents of our young people to attend that with us, and many of them did. And from that experience, that day at Greenwood, and watching Traces of the Trade, a lot of those parents said, I want to do this, because I want to be able to talk to my young person, my teenager, my children, we had a couple of them who were teachers, about these things. And I don't feel equipped to do it. I don't feel equipped to be able to have those conversations. And so how do we then create this? And that's part of why we're looking at creating an adult version of this pilgrimage program as well. So the nuts and bolts, I typically spend some time doing scheduling. Again, I'm a huge spreadsheet person, so literally people make fun of me because my volunteers, when they come, get notebooks that are color-coded, that have times that are just down to the second, basically, of where we're going to be and when we're going to do things and what we're going to be doing. My favorite volunteer, she's totally going to laugh if she ever sees this, but she takes it and then highlights it for herself. It makes me so happy. But she, when she was going through it, one of the things she said was, I can just see the arc just from where we're going from place to place to place. Like, I can see where we're going, like the story, just from looking at the schedule. And so that I felt good about that, because I felt like thinking big and spending a lot of time looking at the context of where we were going and the order of the things that we wanted to do. When I got to actually putting the schedule together, it made it a lot easier. And I felt like that schedule then told the story for us, which was fantastic. Spending a lot of time finalizing details. You make your last calls, make sure everything is booked, make sure all the deposits are paid, all of those things. If you have any questions about like a list of those things, I have a list of all the things you have to think about. And I'm willing to share that list as well. On the pilgrimage, one of the most important things that we did was mark the holy places. And I talked a little bit about this with the beads, but one of the things we did was we were really intentional when we gave out the beads to pray and then to name the injustice that happened at that place. So really speaking about the injustice. What makes a racial reconciliation pilgrimage different is you're challenging and trying to confront injustice in institutions and in society, in our communities. And so we wanted to name that injustice. And we started at the beginning with us naming the injustice, the adults, the chaplains. And throughout the week, then we opened that up to have our young people name the injustice. And by the end of the week, we weren't doing the naming. We didn't even start it. We would open up that prayer time, and they would start naming the injustices that they saw. And they were things that I would not have thought about, that I would not have considered. And it was really powerful to hear them have gone through a learning process, a formational process, to be able to then claim how they were going to confront injustice in society, and to be able to name these things that they saw as injustices, and things that we wouldn't have even seen as different. The processing, we didn't do a lot of sit-down processing. We did some, but my experience with teenagers is that when they're tired, they don't talk about the things you want them to talk about. They talk about other things. And so we really wanted to do our processing in worship. So we typically did, our chaplains led our processing time, and we did it really around those specific injustices, and that's kind of how we processed. And then we would break them up, and we would talk about specific things that they brought up. A lot of our, the first couple days, which I'll talk about why in a second, were lighter in terms of the content, which you think, talking about enslaved persons, why is it lighter? I'll explain that in a minute. But towards the middle, when we spent our day in Montgomery, and we went to the museum that Brian Stevens started, the Center for Racial Justice and Healing, and we went to the memorial, and that you could just feel the shift. It's also the day we did the Jonathan Daniels pilgrimage in Haynesville, and so it was incredible. And we had to kind of really break down the process that day. And you heard the change in how people were processing. You heard the differences in the words that they were choosing and selecting. But most of our processing was really more top-down rather than bottom-up. And we did that specifically because we really wanted to keep it focused and not kind of let it go scattered. So when issues arise in dealing with the unexpected, one of the issues that we encountered along the way is one of our young people was brought up to the front of a group. We were in a room with somebody who was doing a presentation for one of the places we were at, and this young man stood up at the front, and this adult outed that young person in front of the entire group. Didn't know this young person, and asked if they knew that this young person was out. And the young person took it in stride and did a lot of really, handled it really well. There were about 3 of us that were about to come over the seats, literally, but it was hard, and we had to make sure that that young person was okay. So intentionally checking in. We had one, while our group was somewhat diverse in terms of having, so we had a number of indigenous children, or youth on our trip. We only had one African American who came, and there were some pieces that were really difficult for her, and in a different way than they were for the other kids. And so making sure that we were really trying to identify those issues. And then you have just your other practical issues. Relationships, what happens when people break up on a mission trip or a pilgrimage, those kinds of things as well. Dealing with the unexpected, so we had planned to start in New Orleans. We had a really fantastic, what I thought, arc planned out in New Orleans. I had written a script that went with the talk, a walking tour that we were going to take around New Orleans. And then a hurricane decided to come in. And so 2 days before we left, Bourbon Street was already flooded. Lafayette Square was flooded, and the hurricane wasn't even in yet. And we had to totally call an audible. And so we had to totally scrap our plans to go to New Orleans, and we went east instead. Very generous church in Memphis allowed us to stay overnight. And then we went to the Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's home, in Nashville, to talk about slavery. And I think we surprised them a little bit because we made the reservation. We told them that we were having to change this trip. And when we get there, they say, okay, so they start talking to us about Andrew Jackson and the history. And they said, so what are you kind of wanting to get out of while you're here? And I said, well, we're really on a racial reconciliation tour, which, by the way, you have to explain to people what that is. And I said, so really, we're interested in the juxtaposition of how the lives of Andrew Jackson and the people who were white who lived here and the people who were enslaved who lived here. And so they have this activity that they're going to do where they have to go around and look at the different places that people ate and slept and celebrated and where they worked. And talk about both those things. And it was a photo scavenger hunt. So they had to take pictures, and then we processed using the pictures. Where people were buried, where people celebrated marriages. And so we did all of these different things, and they were kind of blown away. And on the back end, she said, when you come out, will you tell me how we did in telling that story? And I said, yeah, I will. And I came out and said, it needs some work, but here were the places where I saw some really good things. And here are the places where my young people actually had some questions. And so after we processed, I wrote her an email, the education director at the Hermitage, and said, here are the things that kind of came up. And she wrote me a very nice email back and said, I think we're going to try to deal with some of those issues. And so I felt like there was this dialogue that came out of really an unexpected trip to a place that I was not expecting to be the best option for this, that turned out to actually have some really fruitful conversation even beyond the pilgrimage, which was fantastic. So you can see kind of the beads on their hands. Coming home, there were a couple of things that our young people wanted to do. The first one was they wanted to have a group just for them where they could continue the conversation and share things. So they set up a group me and are sharing resources and continuing to do that today, which is fantastic. It was also where they kind of recruited themselves to come on this summer's pilgrimage. Hey, I'm coming. Are you coming? That kind of thing. There are no adults in that group, which I get nervous about, but sometimes you have to let that be. And then the adults that went set up a Facebook group and continue to share resources and some really fruitful conversation. And it's been a fantastic resource for me individually to go and see what people see and post, and to be able to put into education for other people, but also just for my continuing education for myself. So it's been really helpful. Pilgrimage gatherings, we had some of our young people talk at our diocesan convention about their experience on our pilgrimage, and kind of getting together to continue that conversation, and then expanding the conversation, trying to encourage their communities to engage questions of racial reconciliation, learn the history of their own congregations. Oklahoma is a relatively new Episcopal diocese. We're not that old, but the history of Oklahoma is fraught with conflict, particularly racial conflict. And so how do our churches, what's the history of our churches, where are they located, how was that land procured, and then having those conversations is really difficult. A lot of our land was procured in land runs, which was taking land that had been divided up and given to different indigenous groups, and then taking that land back and then opening it up for white settlement. And so even the cathedral has a very specific history related to that. So how do we engage that history? One of the things that the young people who went that they're working on is, if you go to the memorial in Montgomery, associated with the Center for Racial Healing and Justice, you will see the various different hanging where the lynchings have taken place. They're metal, and they're inscribed with different locations of different lynchings, and the people's names if they're known, or unknown if they're not, and the date of the lynching, again, if it's known. And then they have matching the same pillars that you can take home. And so our young people are trying to raise the funds to bring Oklahomas to Oklahoma. There's one for Tulsa, and there's one for Tulsa County, and then there's one for Oklahoma as a state. And the young people are trying to raise the funds to do that. And I'm really proud of them for doing that. And that's all on their own. And that's probably one of the biggest things that has come out of that, is that's one of their goals, to do that. So just the last few minutes, that's our group. So, and that's in the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Any questions, nuts and bolts questions related to the spirituality portion, any of it? Any questions? Yeah.
Basic question.
Yeah.
Do you have the itinerary somewhere?
Yes. So I'll give you my email. I have the. Yeah, I will. So the question was, for our people who are live casting too, is do I have the itinerary? Yes, and I'm happy to share that. I'm happy to share any of our resources that we did, where we went, where we stayed. Don't know if the churches where we stayed at want me to share that, but I think we left them all in pretty good shape. But I'm happy to share any of that, the itinerary. We mostly started in Oklahoma City. We were originally going to go to New Orleans, scrapped that. So we went to Memphis and then Nashville, and then we went to Montgomery. But I can give you both itineraries. Spent several days in Montgomery, Birmingham, back to Memphis, and then Little Rock and home. So I'll catch you afterwards. Well, I'm at K, just my first initial K, Houston, Huston, not like the city, looks like Huston, at epiok.org. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's on the app, too. I think you can click onto the app and get contact information. So, yeah.
I had a question about managing the way that young people discuss racial issues.
Yes.
I've worked with a group of kids that are much younger than this, And there was somebody, these are little guys, these are 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, somebody described something as poop brown and then looked at the African-American girl who was in our group and said, "No offense, I'm not a racist." And that created a really terrible feeling in the group, but it was unintentional. And, it was just a really awkward way of dealing with something that he knew was a problem, but he didn't know, how to do that well. And I didn't know, as a group leader, how to address that without making it worse. So I was wondering if you could share anything about those types of things.
So I think one of the things that I think is a challenge that we deal with as youth ministers or people who are facilitating a mission trip or a pilgrimage is that we only get contact for so long, and it's really minimal. And so most of that formational experience around race, the language that people are going to use, comes from other places. It comes from home, it comes from school, it comes from peers. And so to some extent, if that language, if those adults or peers are using language, then people don't know. And so it becomes then our position to help correct in a loving way that fits in with our theological statement, our theological beliefs about how we talk about race and how we talk about people. And I think a lot of the language in that curriculum is really good, related to that being created in God's image means that diversity, we're not colorblind. That was one of the things that we really worked with our youth on, was that they kept saying, well, I'm not a racist because I'm colorblind. I don't see color. And we had to say, no, you do see color. And color is beautiful. And that's the point, is that our diversity is what makes us beautiful. And we have to acknowledge that diversity. We have to acknowledge that we're different. And that all of those differences are still created in the same image of God. That God is so great that there's all this diversity of image. And so I think using that language really makes a difference. And I think you can do that with little kids all the way up. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and who verbal processes everything. And so we've talked about race. And I've intentionally selected children's books so that we can talk about people who are different than what she and I look like. And, how do we, and families that look different than us. And so trying to use that language and then picking words that are really, I think, theologically grounded and giving kids and young people and adults, honestly, language that they can use, that they feel comfortable using is important. Any other questions? Well, thank you for joining me. I'm here for a few minutes afterwards before we head over to Clark Atlanta University, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you. And please feel free to email me. Contact information, I think, is in the app, and I'm happy to talk with anybody if you're planning a pilgrimage and what I can do to help and give you any information that I can. So, thank you.